The morning was quiet, with the soft light of dawn just beginning to touch the tops of houses and trees. In this calm neighborhood, almost everyone was still asleep. The streets were empty except for one figure moving down the sidewalk, Marcus. He jogged at an easy pace, headphones in, completely absorbed in his music. This early morning jog was part of his daily routine, something he did to clear his mind and get a head start on the day. Marcus was a young man, tall and athletic, with a focused look in his eyes. Running was his way of staying disciplined and setting goals, just like his dad had always taught him. He had his favorite songs playing in his ears, helping him tune out everything around him and just focus on the rhythm of his footsteps on the pavement. This neighborhood was familiar to him. He'd grown up here. Every street, every corner, every crack in the sidewalk was like a part of him. But this morning, as he passed by a certain intersection, two cops in a parked patrol car took notice of him. To them, Marcus wasn't just a kid out for a run. No, he was something else. They watched him for a few moments, squinting as if they were trying to place him. Something about Marcus's confident stride seemed to bother them. Maybe it was because he was dressed in a black hoodie and jogging pants, or maybe it was just the color of his skin. Whatever it was, they didn't see a young man going about his morning. Instead, they saw someone who, in their eyes, didn't belong. They looked at each other, sharing a look that seemed to say, "Should we check this guy out?" The two officers didn't even question whether Marcus was a threat. They just assumed he was. One of them, Officer Brady, picked up his radio and whispered into it. "Got a possible suspicious individual here, jogging through the neighborhood." His partner, Officer Daniels, nodded, keeping his eyes locked on Marcus as he continued down the sidewalk, unaware of the attention he was drawing. Inside the patrol car, Brady and Daniels felt justified in their decision to follow him. They'd been on this beat for years and thought they knew everyone who lived in this area. But Marcus was new to them. Maybe it was because they had worked night shifts before and hadn't seen Marcus on his morning runs, or maybe they just assumed he was an outsider. Marcus jogged along, still unaware of the two pairs of eyes following his every move. He slowed down for a moment to adjust his headphones, briefly looking around to admire the quiet of the neighborhood. He didn't notice the patrol car slowly creeping forward to keep up with him. The officers continued to watch, their suspicion only growing. "What's this kid doing here so early?" Daniels muttered. Brady shook his head, as if the answer was obvious. "You know how it is. They come here thinking they can just walk around like they own the place." Daniels smirked, as if they were on the same page. "Hey, kid." A loud voice cut through the silence, startling Marcus. He hadn't noticed the patrol car creeping up behind him, so the sudden sound took him off guard. He pulled out one of his earbuds, his heartbeat quickening as he turned to face the source of the voice. He saw the two officers standing next to their car, looking at him with hard, unreadable expressions. Marcus's first instinct was to ignore them and keep running. After all, he wasn't doing anything wrong. But the tone in the officer's voice made him stop in his tracks. It wasn't friendly or curious. It was demanding, almost accusing. "Yeah, you. What are you doing out here?" the officer repeated, taking a few steps closer. Marcus looked back, unsure of how to respond. "I'm just jogging," he replied, his voice calm but confused. Why were these officers stopping him? The officers exchanged a quick glance, their expressions hardening. They looked at him like he didn't belong there, like he was up to something just by being in the neighborhood. "Just jogging, huh?" Officer Brady said, a hint of sarcasm in his voice. "Don't you think it's a little early for that?" Marcus frowned slightly, not sure what to make of the question. "I jog at this time every morning," he replied, trying to keep his voice steady. Brady raised an eyebrow, clearly unimpressed. "Every morning, huh? Haven't seen you around here before." The way he said it made it sound like he didn't believe Marcus, like he was testing him. Marcus took a deep breath, trying to stay calm. He knew he hadn't done anything wrong, but the way the officers were looking at him made him feel uneasy. "I live in this neighborhood," he said, meeting Brady's gaze. But Brady only narrowed his eyes, his expression skeptical. "Oh yeah? Where exactly?" he asked, crossing his arms. Marcus felt his patience wearing thin, but he knew better than to argue. He pointed down the street, toward his house, which wasn't too far away. The officers glanced in the direction he pointed, then back at Marcus. "All right, kid, let's see some ID," Daniel said, stepping closer. Marcus's heart sank. He hadn't brought his wallet because he was just out for a quick run. But he explained this as calmly as he could. "I didn't bring my ID. I'm just out for a jog, that's all." Brady's expression turned to one of annoyance. "Convenient," he muttered, as if not bringing an ID was somehow suspicious. "Look, we don't know you, and we don't know why you're here. You could be anybody, understand?" Marcus felt a pang of frustration, but he tried to keep his face neutral. He had lived in this neighborhood for years, and yet here he was, being treated like a stranger. "I already told you, I live here," he said, his voice firmer now. But his words seemed to fall on deaf ears. Brady shook his head, clearly not convinced. "We're going to need to check you out, just to be sure." Without waiting for a response, Brady gestured for Marcus to step closer. Marcus hesitated, feeling a flash of anger. This was supposed to be a peaceful morning jog, his time to relax before the day started. And now, he was being treated like a criminal in his own neighborhood. "Is there a problem, officer?" he asked, his voice steady, though he could feel his heart pounding. Brady gave a small, cold smile. "Only if you make one, kid. Now, are you going to cooperate, or are we going to have to do this the hard way?" Marcus clenched his jaw, resisting the urge to say something that might make things worse. He knew how these situations could go, especially if he lost his temper. Instead, he took a deep breath and nodded, stepping closer as instructed. The officers wasted no time, patting him down and checking his pockets, their movements rough and impersonal. They found nothing, of course, but that didn't stop them from looking at him like he was hiding something. "Where are you really from, kid?" Daniels asked, as if he didn't believe a word Marcus had said. "I already told you. I live here." "Right down the street," Marcus replied, his voice steady but his patience running thin. But the officers weren't interested in his answers. To them, he was just another kid who didn't belong, someone they had decided was suspicious for reasons he couldn't understand. The whole time, Marcus tried to keep his face calm, not letting them see the frustration building inside him. He knew he hadn't done anything wrong, but in that moment, he felt powerless. All he could do was stand there, waiting for them to finish, hoping this would be over soon. But as he stood there, watching them search his pockets, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to change. He didn't know what it was, but there was a sense of inevitability in the air, as if this morning jog was leading up to something he couldn't yet see. And the officers, so sure of themselves, had no idea either. They didn't know that in the next few minutes, their world would be turned upside down. One of the officers took a step closer, his hand casually resting on his holster. His eyes narrowed as he looked at Marcus, studying him as if he were trying to find something hidden. "What are you doing here?" he asked, his voice low but firm, laced with a strange kind of suspicion. "Don't you know people don't like strangers wandering around here?" The words hit Marcus like a sharp jab. He felt the weight of them immediately, the meaning behind them clear as day. He knew exactly what the officer was implying, and it wasn't pleasant. Here he was, just out for a morning run like he always was. But to these two officers, he was someone who didn't belong, someone who had no right to be there. He hadn't done anything wrong, yet they were treating him as if he were a suspect in some crime, as if his mere presence on the sidewalk was a threat. Marcus took a slow breath, doing his best to stay calm. He'd been in situations like this before, moments where people judged him without knowing him, where they made assumptions just because of how he looked. But it didn't make it any easier. This was his neighborhood, the place where he'd grown up, where he felt safe and comfortable. Yet these officers were acting as if he were a stranger, an outsider. "I live around here," he replied calmly, standing his ground. His voice was steady, though he could feel a flicker of frustration deep inside. Why should he have to explain himself? He hadn't done anything wrong. He was just out for a run, minding his own business. But his answer seemed to amuse the officers rather than reassure them. One of them chuckled, a dry, humorless sound that felt more like a taunt. "Sure, kid," he said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "And I'm the mayor." Marcus felt his jaw tighten, but he forced himself to stay calm. He knew better than to let anger get the best of him in a situation like this. The officers didn't seem interested in hearing his side of things. They had already made up their minds about him. Every word that came out of their mouths was laced with disdain, as if his very presence was somehow offensive to them. The other officer shook his head, his expression hard and unyielding. "Look, kid," he said, his tone cold and dismissive. "You need to understand something. People around here don't take kindly to strangers, especially ones who don't seem to know their place." The officer's words were like a slap in the face, and Marcus could feel his frustration rising. It wasn't fair. He hadn't done anything wrong, yet here he was, being treated like a criminal in his own neighborhood. But he knew he couldn't afford to lose his temper. He had to keep his cool, no matter how hard it was. "I'm not a stranger," he said quietly, his voice steady despite the frustration boiling inside him. "I've been jogging this route for weeks now. I live just a few blocks from here." But his words seemed to fall on deaf ears. The officers looked at each other, exchanging a knowing glance that made Marcus feel small and powerless. They weren't interested in the truth. To them, he was guilty by appearance alone, and there was nothing he could say that would change their minds. One of the officers took a step closer, his gaze hardening as he looked down at Marcus. "We don't care how many times you've jogged through here," he said, his tone sharp. "You don't belong here, understand? This isn't a place for people like you to just wander around." The words stung, and Marcus could feel a lump forming in his throat. He wanted to shout, to tell them that they were wrong, that he had just as much right to be here as anyone else. But he knew that would only make things worse, so he took a deep breath, forcing himself to stay calm, to keep his voice steady. "I'm just out for a run," he said quietly. "I'm not bothering anyone." But his response only seemed to anger the officers further. One of them let out a harsh laugh, shaking his head, as if he couldn't believe Marcus's audacity. "Listen, kid," he said, his voice dripping with disdain. "You think you can just walk around here, doing whatever you want, like you own the place. This isn't your neighborhood. You don't belong here." Marcus felt his hands clench into fists, his nails digging into his palms as he tried to keep his emotions in check. He had never felt so helpless, so powerless. He knew he hadn't done anything wrong, yet here he was, being treated like a criminal for simply existing. "I already told you," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I live here. This is my neighborhood too." But his words seemed to bounce off the officers like they were made of stone. They looked at him with cold, unfeeling eyes, as if he were invisible, as if his words didn't matter. To them, he was just a kid who didn't belong, someone who needed to be put in his place. One of the officers took a step closer, his hand still resting on his holster, a silent reminder of his authority. "If you know what's good for you, kid, you'll move along," he said, his voice low and menacing. "We don't want any trouble here, and we're sure you don't either." Marcus felt his heart pounding in his chest, his mind racing as he tried to think of a way to defuse the situation. He knew he hadn't done anything wrong, but the way the officers were looking at him made him feel like he was guilty of something, like he had no right to stand up for himself. He wanted to shout, to tell them that they were wrong, that he had every right to be here, that this was his neighborhood too. But he knew that would only make things worse, so he took a deep breath, forcing himself to stay calm, to keep his voice steady. "I'm not looking for trouble," he said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. "I'm just out for a run." But his words seemed to fall on deaf ears. The officers looked at each other, a silent understanding passing between them, as if they had already decided his fate. To them, he was just another kid who didn't belong, someone who needed to be taught a lesson. One of the officers took a step closer, his hand still resting on his holster, a silent reminder of his authority. "If you know what's good for you, kid, you'll move along," he said, his voice low and menacing. "We don't want any trouble here, and we're sure you don't either." The word hung in the air, heavy with a sense of finality. The two officers exchanged another glance, and one of them smirked before taking a step closer. "All right, kid, let's see what you're carrying." "Turn out your pockets," he ordered, his tone leaving no room for argument. The demand felt sharp and humiliating. They were treating Marcus as if he were a criminal, as if he were hiding something dangerous or illegal. Marcus's face stayed calm, but inside, frustration and anger bubbled up. He knew he didn't have anything suspicious on him. He'd only brought his essentials, his phone, a few keys, and some cash. That was it. But he didn't argue. He knew that arguing would only make things worse, so he held his head high and did as they asked, reaching into his pockets and pulling out the small items he'd brought with him on his run. He opened his hands, showing the officers the contents of his pockets. A sleek smartphone rested in one hand, a small set of keys in the other, and a crumpled bill with a couple of loose coins. Nothing unusual, nothing dangerous, just the normal things he needed for a morning jog. But the officers didn't seem satisfied. One officer reached out and snatched the phone from Marcus's hand, holding it up as if it were some kind of prize. He turned it over in his hand, looking at it with a sneer. "Nice phone," he said, his voice full of sarcasm. "Bet you didn't pay for it." Marcus felt his jaw tighten, his patience wearing thin. He had saved up for that phone with money from his part-time job, working long hours after school to earn it. Every dollar he'd earned had gone toward that phone, and he was proud of it. But the officer's words felt like an insult, like he was saying Marcus wasn't capable of buying something nice on his own. Still, Marcus kept his mouth shut, refusing to let them get a reaction out of him. The other officer watched him closely, looking for any sign of anger or defiance. He seemed almost disappointed when Marcus stayed calm, his face showing nothing but quiet strength. Marcus knew they wanted him to react, to get angry or defensive, but he wouldn't give them that satisfaction. He just stood there, his face expressionless, letting them go through his things, knowing he had nothing to hide. "You think you're tough, huh?" The officer with the phone taunted, raising an eyebrow as he looked at Marcus. "Think you can walk around here, acting like you own the place?" Marcus didn't respond, but his eyes held a quiet, unwavering strength. He knew something they didn't, something that would change everything. He watched them with a calm that seemed to unnerve the officers, as if he were waiting for something, counting each second, each word they threw at him. The officers exchanged another look, clearly frustrated by his lack of reaction. They were used to people getting defensive or scared in situations like this. They expected him to fumble, to explain himself, maybe even to beg. But Marcus did none of those things. He just stood there, calm and silent, watching them with steady eyes, almost as if he were the one in control. The officer holding the phone sneered, shaking his head as he looked at Marcus. "You think just because you've got a nice phone, you're somebody," he said, his tone mocking. "Bet you think you're special, don't you?" Marcus still said nothing, but inside, he was counting every word, every sneer, every gesture. He was storing it all away, filing it in his mind for later. Because he knew that once they were done, there would be consequences they couldn't even begin to imagine. The other officer stepped forward, crossing his arms as he looked down at Marcus, trying to appear intimidating. "Let me guess," he said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "You're going to tell us some story about how you're an upstanding citizen, right? That you're just out for a morning jog." He laughed, a harsh, mocking sound that echoed in the quiet street. "Yeah, we've heard it all before, kid. You're not fooling anyone." Marcus felt his patience wearing thinner with each passing second, but he forced himself to stay calm. He knew that losing his temper would only give them what they wanted, a reason to push him further. So he kept his gaze steady, meeting the officer's eyes with a calm defiance that seemed to unsettle them. Marcus wasn't about to let them break him. He had faced tougher situations before, and he wasn't about to back down now. The officer with the phone tossed it back to Marcus with a smirk. "Here, take your little toy back," he sneered. "But don't think that just because you have a fancy phone, you can walk around here like you're something special." Marcus caught the phone, slipping it back into his pocket without a word. He kept his face blank, showing no reaction to their taunts, even though each word stung. "What's the matter, kid?" the first officer said, his voice mocking. "Cat got your tongue. Thought you have something to say for yourself." He laughed, clearly amused by his own words, while the other officer watched Marcus with a cold, calculating gaze, as if trying to figure him out. But Marcus stayed silent, his expression calm and steady. He wasn't about to give them the satisfaction of seeing him react. Inside, he felt a fire burning, a quiet anger that fueled his resolve. He knew that this would all be over soon, and when it was, they would regret every word, every sneer, every insult. "You're awfully quiet," the second officer said, narrowing his eyes. "Got nothing to say, or are you just too scared to talk back?" His words were meant to provoke, to push Marcus into a reaction. But Marcus wouldn't give them that satisfaction. He kept his gaze steady, his silence more powerful than any words he could have spoken. Inside, Marcus knew that the truth would come out soon enough. He knew something they didn't, something that would change everything. And as he stood there, letting them throw their taunts and insults, he felt a strange sense of calm, a quiet strength that they couldn't touch. The officers continued to sneer and taunt him, each word laced with contempt. But Marcus held his ground, his eyes steady, his expression calm. He knew that they were trying to get a rise out of him, to make him lose his cool. But he wouldn't give them that satisfaction. He was stronger than that. "You're just another punk, kid," one of the officers said, shaking his head, "thinking you can walk around here like you're somebody. But you're nobody. Just remember that." Marcus's jaw tightened, but he kept silent. He knew who he was, and he knew that their words couldn't change that. Inside, he was counting each insult, each sneer, storing it away in his mind. Because soon, they would learn the truth. And when they did, they would realize just how wrong they had been. The officers watched him, waiting for a reaction, but he gave them nothing. His calm silence seemed to frustrate them, as if they couldn't understand why he wasn't reacting the way they wanted him to. But Marcus didn't need to say anything. He knew that his silence was more powerful than any words he could have spoken. And as the officers continued their taunts, unaware of the truth that was about to unfold, Marcus stood tall, a quiet strength radiating from him. He knew who he was, and he knew that soon they would know too. The officers exchanged a look, silently agreeing it was time to take this situation to the next level. They didn't need any more words from Marcus. One officer moved forward, reaching behind his back, fingers brushing over a set of handcuffs. He stepped closer, his hand moving steadily as he prepared to grab Marcus's wrist. The metallic glint of the cuffs caught the morning light, shining like a symbol of control, of finality. Marcus's heart pounded as he felt the officer's hand near his arm. He knew he hadn't done anything wrong, but the weight of the situation was pressing down on him, hard and unrelenting. He took a deep breath, ready to face whatever came next with strength and composure. He'd come this far, staying calm despite their taunts and accusations. He wasn't going to break now. Just as the officer was about to clasp the cuffs around Marcus's wrists, a low, powerful hum broke the silence. All three heads turned, startled by the unexpected sound. A sleek black sedan glided smoothly down the road, its dark windows gleaming in the early light. It was no ordinary car. It had a presence, an authority that demanded attention. As it pulled up beside them, the officers' hands hesitated, confusion flashing across their faces. The car came to a smooth stop, and the back door opened. Out stepped a tall man, his figure casting a long shadow over the scene. He was dressed in a sharp, dark suit that fit him like it was made just for him, and he carried himself with a confidence that was impossible to ignore. His gaze was icy, piercing as he took in the sight before him. The officers, the handcuffs, his son. For a moment, he simply stood there, surveying the situation with an expression that was as unreadable as it was intimidating. The officers' faces went from confusion to shock as they realized who was standing before them. This was no ordinary man. This was their boss, the chief of police himself. The chief was known for his no-nonsense approach, for his strict rules and high standards. They knew he didn't tolerate mistakes, especially ones like this. The officers straightened up immediately, snapping to attention as the chief's gaze settled on them. Any trace of arrogance or mockery vanished from their faces. They were no longer the ones in control. Now, they were the ones being watched, being judged. The power dynamic had shifted, and they could feel it like a weight pressing down on them. "What's going on here?" the chief demanded, his voice cutting through the morning stillness like a blade. His tone was cold, each word carrying a weight that left no room for excuses. He didn't raise his voice, but his presence alone was enough to make the officers uneasy. The two officers stammered, their earlier confidence crumbling as they tried to explain themselves. We were just doing our duty, sir," one of them managed to say, his voice shaky and uncertain. "This kid was acting suspicious, so we thought it would be best to, check him out, make sure he wasn't causing trouble." The chief's eyes narrowed, his expression hardening as he listened. He looked at Marcus, standing there with calm defiance, his eyes steady and strong. The chief could see the marks of what had happened. The way Marcus's face was set, the way his hands were clenched at his sides, the look in his eyes that spoke of resilience. And it was clear that this was no ordinary encounter, no simple misunderstanding. The chief turned his gaze back to the officers, and for a moment, there was a silence so heavy it was almost suffocating. The officers shifted uncomfortably under his stare, the weight of their actions pressing down on them. They could feel the anger simmering beneath his calm exterior, and it made them wish they could disappear. "This kid," the chief said slowly, his voice cold and measured, "is my son." The words hit the officers like a thunderbolt, leaving them speechless. Their faces went pale as the realization sank in. They had been roughing up, mocking, and intimidating the chief's own son. The same kid they had been treating with such disdain was the son of the man who held their careers in his hands. For a moment, nobody moved. The officers stared at Marcus, then back at the chief, their minds racing, trying to process what they had just heard. The blood drained from their faces as they realized the gravity of their mistake. They had crossed a line they could never uncross. Marcus finally spoke, breaking the tense silence. "Dad," he said, his voice quiet but steady, a mixture of relief and frustration in his tone. He had been waiting for this moment, for the truth to finally come out. The single word, "Dad," hung in the air, carrying a weight that left the officers stunned and silent. The chief's expression softened as he looked at his son, a flash of concern and protectiveness in his eyes. His tough, icy exterior melted for a moment, replaced by the look of a father seeing his child in a difficult situation. He took a step toward Marcus, placing a firm hand on his shoulder. "Are you all right, son?" he asked, his voice quieter now, a note of care slipping through his usually controlled tone. Marcus nodded, his face calm but his eyes saying so much more. There was a strength in his gaze, a quiet pride that had withstood the officer's taunts and accusations. He looked at his father, his shoulders relaxing for the first time since the officers had stopped him. He knew that now, finally, things would be made right. The officers watched this exchange in stunned silence, too shocked to say anything. Their minds raced, scrambling for explanations, excuses, anything that might save them from the consequences they now saw looming over them. But there were no words that could erase what they had done. They had shown their true colors, and there was no taking it back. The chief turned back to them, his expression once again hard and unyielding. He didn't have to raise his voice. His presence alone was enough to convey the weight of his anger and disappointment. "You two," he began, his voice as cold as steel, "need to explain to me why you felt it was necessary to treat my son like a criminal in his own neighborhood." The officers stammered, their words tumbling over each other as they tried to explain, but their excuses sounded hollow, even to their own ears. "Sir, we didn't know he was your son," one of them finally managed to say, his voice shaky. "We thought he was. Well, we thought he was someone who didn't belong here." The chief's gaze hardened, his eyes flashing with a cold anger that sent a chill down their spines. "So you assumed he was up to no good because he was, what? Out for a jog, minding his own business." His words were sharp, each one hitting like a blow. The officers looked down, unable to meet his gaze, their faces red with shame. "I expect my officers to protect and serve, not to judge and intimidate," the chief continued, his tone unwavering. "And I especially don't expect to see this kind of behavior in my own precinct, in my own neighborhood, toward my own son." The officers could feel the weight of his words pressing down on them, crushing any remaining sense of authority they had. They were no longer the ones in control. Now, they were the ones being judged, held accountable for their actions. The realization was bitter, and they could feel the sting of regret washing over them, though they knew it was far too late. "You're both dismissed for the day," the chief said finally, his voice leaving no room for argument. "Report to my office first thing tomorrow morning. We're going to have a very serious conversation about your behavior and the standards I expect from my officers." The officers nodded, their faces pale, their voices barely above a whisper as they mumbled their agreement. They didn't dare look at Marcus, whose calm, steady gaze had remained on them the whole time, a silent reminder of their mistake. They turned and walked away, their heads hanging low, the weight of their actions heavy on their shoulders. As they left, Marcus felt a sense of relief wash over him. He looked up at his father, a quiet gratitude in his eyes. His dad gave him a small nod, a silent acknowledgement of what he had endured, of the strength he had shown. The chief's hand remained on Marcus's shoulder as they stood together in the morning light, the tension slowly fading away. They didn't need words. The bond between them, the understanding of what had just happened, was enough. And as they stood there, side by side, Marcus knew that he was safe, that justice had been served, and that his father had his back, now and always. The chief's eyes locked onto the two officers, his gaze icy and unyielding. He stood tall, his shoulders squared, exuding a presence that demanded respect. This was not the look of a man willing to forgive or overlook what he had just witnessed. His voice, steady and calm, cut through the silence like a blade. "You're both dismissed for the day. Report to my office first thing tomorrow morning," he said firmly, leaving no room for questions or excuses. "We're going to have a serious talk about your behavior on the job." The officers stood there, frozen in place, their faces pale and drained of any hint of confidence or authority. They had started the morning full of pride, acting as if they owned the streets, but now all of that had been stripped away. In that moment, they were no longer powerful, no longer in control. They were simply two men facing the consequences of their actions, and there was no escaping it. They looked at each other, a flash of desperation crossing their faces, but they knew there was nothing they could say to fix this. Slowly, they lowered their heads, nodding in silent agreement, too stunned to argue, too embarrassed to even speak. Their earlier arrogance, the mocking tones, the sneers, they were all gone, replaced by the realization of what they had done and the mistake they had made. Without another word, they turned and began to walk away, each step heavier than the last, the weight of shame pressing down on their shoulders. They moved slowly, as if hoping to somehow escape the eyes of the chief and his son. But the truth was there was no escape from this. They would carry this mistake with them, a reminder of what happens when one acts without respect or understanding. Marcus watched them go, his gaze steady, his expression calm. He had stayed strong throughout the entire ordeal, never letting them see the frustration or the anger that had built up inside him. Now, as he watched them leave, he felt a quiet sense of satisfaction. Justice had been served, not just for him, but for everyone who had ever been treated unfairly, judged without reason, or looked down upon simply because of who they were. This was bigger than just him. It was a reminder that respect and fairness were not privileges to be given out as favors, but rights that everyone deserved. As the officers finally disappeared down the street, their figures growing smaller with each step, Marcus felt the tension in his shoulders begin to ease. The weight he had been carrying, the fear, the frustration, the helplessness began to lift. It was over. He had faced their judgment, stood his ground, and in the end, he had come out stronger. He took a deep breath, feeling the cool morning air fill his lungs, a sense of relief washing over him. The chief turned to him, his expression softening as he looked at his son. He placed a firm, reassuring hand on Marcus's shoulder, the warmth of it offering comfort and support. "I'm sorry you had to go through that, son," he said, his voice filled with both regret and determination. "You shouldn't have to face that kind of treatment, not here, not anywhere. Things are going to change around here starting now." The words hung in the air, carrying a promise, a commitment to make things right. Marcus looked up at his father, seeing the strength and resolve in his eyes. His dad wasn't just saying this to make him feel better. He meant it. This wasn't just about one incident. This was about creating real change, about making sure that no one else would have to go through what he had just experienced. Marcus could see the weight of responsibility his father felt, the determination to protect not just his son, but everyone in the community. For the first time that morning, Marcus allowed himself a small, relieved smile. He had held everything in for so long, trying to stay strong, to show no weakness. But now, standing beside his father, he felt safe, understood, and most importantly, respected. He knew that he didn't have to face this battle alone, that he had someone in his corner, someone who would fight for him and stand up for what was right. The two of them stood there in the morning light, father and son, united by a shared strength and a bond that no amount of prejudice or misunderstanding could break. The street was quiet again, the tension and chaos of the earlier moments fading away, leaving behind a sense of calm, of resolution. Marcus took another deep breath, feeling the weight of everything that had happened settle into a memory, a lesson, a reminder of who he was and what he stood for. He looked up at his father, his smile growing a little wider, a sense of pride swelling within him. He knew that this experience had changed him, had made him stronger, and he knew that his father's words were not just a promise. They were a commitment to making their community a better, fairer place for everyone. And as they stood there, side by side, father and son, they knew that this was only the beginning. As the morning sun rose higher, casting warm light over the quiet neighborhood, there was a sense of calm settling over everything. The street was still and peaceful again, but now it felt different, almost like it was holding its breath, waiting for something new, something better. The scene of tension and misunderstanding had faded, leaving behind a feeling of possibility, a hope that things might just be different from this moment forward. Marcus stood there, looking around at the place he called home, a place where he should have felt safe and welcome, but had just faced something deeply challenging. He couldn't shake the memory of those moments, the quick, hurtful judgments made against him, and the way he had been looked at with suspicion simply because he didn't fit the image those officers had in their minds. Yet despite it all, he had stood his ground, kept his strength, and shown that no one has the right to judge or mistreat another person based on shallow assumptions. He hadn't backed down, and he hadn't let anger or frustration consume him. It struck him how quickly people can make snap judgments, forming opinions in seconds without understanding the full story. Those officers had looked at him and seen only what they wanted to see. They hadn't seen the hardworking young man who jogged to stay disciplined, who had a father working tirelessly to make their community safer and fairer. They hadn't seen his resilience, his quiet strength, his determination to hold his head high no matter the circumstances. Marcus realized that many people in this world experience moments like the one he had just gone through. People make judgments based on looks, appearances, or assumptions, often without stopping to consider that there is always more to a person than meets the eye. But today, he felt like he had shown everyone, that no one should be underestimated or unfairly judged. He had proven that quiet strength is just as powerful as loud defiance, and that respect and fairness are values worth standing up for. As Marcus turned to his father, he saw a look of pride and understanding in his father's eyes. His father had seen it all, had watched as his son faced down the unfairness, the accusations, and had come through with dignity. His father's words earlier, "Things are going to change around here, starting now," had been more than just words. They were a promise, a commitment to building a future where respect and kindness replaced fear and suspicion. The chief was more than just a figure of authority to Marcus. He was a father, a mentor, and now, a symbol of the change that Marcus hoped would take root not just in their neighborhood, but in the minds of everyone who might be quick to judge or quick to assume. His father was committed to creating a space where no one else would have to feel the sting of suspicion, where everyone would have the freedom to walk, run, or simply exist without feeling like they didn't belong. And as Marcus stood beside his father in the early morning light, he felt a powerful sense of pride, not just in himself, but in his family, his community, and in the idea that people could grow, learn, and change. He hoped that those officers had learned something today, that maybe they had seen a little more of the world and would carry this experience with them, using it to change how they viewed others. Maybe next time they would look a little deeper, listen a little longer, and hold back judgment until they truly understood the person in front of them.